Cool. All right, do I have everyone's permission to record this for public viewing? If you
Yes, sir.
will be participating, thank you, Graham. And thank you, Maya. And let's see, hopefully we'll have some more people speak up if they are able to join in. All right, so I'm going to proceed here, understanding that everyone who is unmuting themselves to join the conversation consents to the recording. And we'll go back to screen sharing here. All right, here's where we were left off. Okay, no, sorry. All right. Well, okay. I've already revealed the title, I guess, of this work and the date, so maybe that helps us a little bit. What do you all think of when you see this? Does it
It
yeah.
It reminds me of one of those like foldable, like so you can't see in a window or something, you know?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, like a screen or a partition.
Yeah.
That might be used for privacy.
Yeah.
Right.
But it's like design, like architecture type.
Okay. So it looks very very designed, very modern. Okay, good. Yeah. Sort of industrial aesthetic. And as you said, also it looks very architectural.
Mm-hmm.
So it incorporates these sort of partition-like screens, but into a larger framework that sort of defines an interior space, and kind of actively, you can see it as a kind of intervention in the architecture of the space, the spatial setting of this room, whatever it is. Okay, so that right off the bat gives us something kind of interesting to talk about, because we can relate it, first of all, to a kind of functional design, right? Like real world objects that we might encounter outside of a museum or a gallery. So where might these kinds of screens or partitions be found in the everyday real world? In what sorts of contexts?
It reminds me of like a hotel.
Okay. Like maybe in a hotel lobby to separate seating space or something like that.
Mm-hmm.
Good. Yeah, for sure. Some kind of high-end hotel, maybe like a boutique hotel with that features this kind of decor in the lobby. So it has that aspect as well. It's functional, but also very decorative.
I don't know. To me, they kind of seem like high-tech blinds, like like the blue strip on your windscreen or your car that like blocks out the sun. This looks like something that would like come down on like some futuristic building that would like alleviate the brightness of a room or something.
Right. Okay. So something you might see, say on like an office tower or something.
Yeah.
Sure. So in something that you might find in the context of, corporate architecture, perhaps, beyond, I mean, maybe it could be incorporated into residential architecture as well, if we're talking about a really super modern, fancy house. But the use of steel and plexi and glass, maybe these things we associate more with the kind of glass tower, skyscraper type architecture that we see in cities, urban contexts. Any other thoughts, impressions, questions, concerns, skepticism? So we've talked about how this might fit into a non-art context. How could we understand or appreciate it as art? Silence. Or are there reasons not to appreciate it as art?
The title's kind of interesting, and it makes you think of some like local discussion screen, like kind of an interesting title.
Yeah, what's interesting about it to you, Maya?
That it uses the word like local.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
I'm not sure exactly what the background behind why you use that word or why there's a discussion around it.
Right.
Just kind of question it, I guess.
Yeah. So what questions does the use of that term raise about this piece? Like, if this is a piece that is somehow designed to structure discussions, or somehow give shape to, or kind of regulate or foster discussion, in what sense could we understand this term local? Is it a screen that's built for local discussions?
Yeah, like there's little windows where, like, if someone's standing on one side, you can see them through one window, like,
Okay.
heights. So I'm not really sure.
So maybe in that sense, right? Like you've got, rather than having one discussion, let's say between people on one side of the screen and people on the other,
Mm-hmm.
Let's say there weren't any screens. If this were a completely open framework, then you could have everybody on either side participating in a shared discussion.
Mm-hmm.
But it does seem, as you say, Maya, that there are certain areas that are kind of divided or separated out for communication across this divide, or from one side of the screen to the other, so that maybe it is designed for multiple local conversations, meaning conversations that are specific to one side of the screen or the other, higher up, or lower down, multiple kind of divergent discussions maybe about completely different things.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So that
yeah
that kind of changes it from like architecture, like the title, and then maybe there's something where you interact with it.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, if we saw it as architecture, if we saw it as corporate office decor or something like that, or then, you know, there are maybe aspects of this structure that would seem out of place in that context. You know, the idea of maybe requiring people to have discussions through an opening in a screen, that's not something that maybe appears especially efficient if the goal is to encourage discussion. And even if we were to think about, you know, a different context for the piece, if we were trying to think about what kinds of discussions you might have across this screen in an art gallery or an exhibition opening or something, you've got openings down at the bottom, which would require you to kind of get down on like your hands and knees to look through it or to talk to somebody on the other side. Then you've got openings way at the top. The screen is like 96 inches tall, I guess. So that's like 8 feet high. Most people aren't tall enough to comfortably, you know, look through that opening in the upper right there, much less have a conversation. So, you know, the question becomes like, if this piece really designed to facilitate communication, or is it in some ways maybe also designed to make communication more difficult? And what kind of, you know, what the goal really is this an object that's intended to serve a use, or is it an object that is kind of making a statement? You know, is it meant to serve the aims of communication in some way or another, or is it making a kind of statement about communication? What kinds of discussions or conversations does something like this invite is another question.
I'd say it almost invites like one-sided conversations, because if you have people standing on either side of it trying to converse with each other, then, I mean, no matter how you try to look at them, you're going to be staring at them through a screen, and it really just kind of blocks communication.
Yeah.
But at the same time, this thing really encourages you to talk about it, because it's weird. Like, we don't really know what to make of it, and so it inspires us to talk about it.
Right. So that's great. That's another way to think about the meaning of this title, right? Maybe it's not a screen that's designed to facilitate discussion. Maybe it's a screen that is the object of discussion. Or maybe it's somehow both. Like, we are talking about how hard it is to maybe talk across it. It makes us more aware of the ways in which discussions are structured and across different contexts. You know, ordinarily in a gallery, which is a wide open room, it's very easy to have a conversation, although the kinds of conversations you have are maybe constrained by the environment. People feel like they need to have these very high-minded, you know, conversations about aesthetics or art or whatever it is that they're looking at, art history. The kinds of discussions you have in a you know, corporate headquarters or in an office, corporate office environment is going to be very different. But also, you know, there you have this question of power, like, who are you allowed to speak to, and in what contexts? Like where is conversation invited or encouraged, and where is it discouraged? If you're sitting in a cubicle, then you probably are surrounded by partitions that are designed to prevent the people sitting next to you from overhearing your phone conversations. On the other hand, if you are giving a presentation, then maybe you're making use of some kind of a screen in order to share your ideas. That takes us back. So this is a piece from 2001, 2002. If we look back at some of Gillick's earlier projects, we can try and maybe trace a certain line of investigation here that could potentially connects them. He was working on something called this pinboard project, which consists of these very generic, very kind of old school pinboards, or these like fabric panels that are designed to be used with push pins as a kind of memo board, or a place to organize information, paper, printed information. This is maybe kind of before the age of, this is 1992 actually. This would have been right around the time that the World Wide Web was just starting to be developed. So computers were being used, but there was still a lot of communication took place via print or via printed texts. So from our perspective, and maybe even in 1992, there was something a little bit nostalgic about this idea of a kind of pinboard. But it would have seemed less exotic or less old-fashioned than it appears today. So what does this piece have in common with the local discussion screen, if anything? And how are they different?
Well, I guess they both prompt discussion, because there's a bunch of varying things on this board, and I'm not sure how they correlate because we can't really see them too well, but I'm sure that's part of the point.
Yeah, well, we could try to imagine this object also in a different context. If we were to encounter this kind of a pinboard in, maybe that's the first question to start with. Where might we encounter a pinboard like this, leaving aside the things that are actually pinned to it? Probably like office spaces, maybe schools or educational settings.
Yeah, like somebody's office or something.
Yeah, so like, something like this would have served the purpose of, just organizing maybe reminders or piece of information that some person needs to refer to on a regular basis. Like in an office setting, it would probably be, to-do lists or memos or things, or important phone numbers, things like that. So maybe serving the function less of communication or discussion with others, and more a means of reminding oneself about things, or a point of reference for certain kinds of information, like an aid to memory, so you don't have to remember all those, phone numbers or figures or whatever they are. But then if we start looking at what's actually pinned here, we see the upper left, something that looks like some kind of diagram, maybe, or floor plan or chart. It's hard to make out, as Graham says. We've got some clippings from magazines, perhaps, a typewritten memo of some kind or document on this gray paper in the lower right, and then some more personal things. This photograph here, this glossy color photograph on the right, or this image of a topless woman taken from who knows where. It could be a magazine. It looks like there's something printed here, but it's hard to imagine, what kind of magazine would publish an image like that. Some other piece of paper at the bottom here showing, I don't think I have a detail, but again, something that looks more kind of personal in nature rather than business related. So a strange kind of mashup of different kinds of information, different sources of information, and images, private versus public, personal versus, business or work oriented. Here's another example. I don't know the details about this one, but it is quite different in terms of the contents here. Milan House Project is what seemed to be sketched out floor plans on some of these sheets, and again, typewritten text. What about a comparison of these two different pinboard works? How is this one different from the previous one?
Looks like one person pinned all this up versus random people pinning the other stuff.
Okay. Mm-hmm. Yeah, this looks much more kind of goal-directed, focused.
Mm-hmm. It's definitely a lot more cohesive than the other one is, especially considering the like size of the paper. Mm-hmm. And they're all placed right next to each other as opposed to sporadically. And I don't know, the content is a lot more, I guess, generalized.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and more cohesive, maybe also visually, would you say, Graham?
Yeah, definitely.
So and also with the different colors of paper, it takes on a much more aesthetic or kind of designed quality. So not only the content here, if these are dealing with the design of a house, as we've gathered from what we can read or hear or make out of the contents, but also just the way the sheets of paper are pinned to the board, and their colors, the color of the board itself, suggests a kind of interest in design in the, the visual or aesthetic aspects of design that resonates with this later work here. Okay. Here is another screen piece. This one is called Delay Screen. So again, the title is very suggestive, right? Suggestive maybe of barriers to communication. Delays can be a kind of barrier. But a temporal barrier rather than a spatial barrier. And it makes us think of all the kind of delays we encounter in communication across distances, maybe. Or, in the age of telecommunications, the kinds of delays introduced by those communication technologies. Here's a piece with a somewhat different kind of title, Returning to an Abandoned Plant. What kind of plant do you think he's talking about? You talking about the kind of plant that grows in the ground, or what other kind of plant might this refer to?
Maybe like some sort of like steel plant or factory or something.
Sure. Yeah, absolutely. Now, is there any way that we can connect that title with what we're looking at, though? Why do those sorts of plants, those sorts of factories, why might they end up being abandoned? Say like a steel factory or an automotive, like a
outsourcing.
Okay, yeah. So like globalization, less and less of the goods that we buy are produced in this country. Everybody's familiar with this whole discussion, about how a lot of manufacturing jobs in this country have been lost as we transition to a more service-based economy, also sometimes described as an information economy. So all these threads kind of start to come together here, right? Like, we think about the service industries, we think of maybe hospitality, travel, tourism. We think about hotels as settings where we might find this kind of high-end design or decor. Same sort of design aesthetic that we saw in local discussion screen. The idea of corporate architecture also as in the way that it's evolved from pin boards to this more, if we were to look at this from an architectural perspective, there are other terms we could apply to it, without knowing whether or not all the elements here are fixed in place. There's something about these screens that suggests modularity, right? Like that maybe they can be adjusted, moved up and down like blinds, or shifted, like sliding doors. And so if you read about the kinds of office environments that they've tried to create at a company like Google, you hear a lot about this idea of flexible design or open floor plan office spaces that are supposed to facilitate collaboration and dialogue among employees. So these are kind of like emblems, you could say, maybe, of this new information economy, this new service economy. And with this title, Returning to an Abandoned Plant, it seems like Gillick is kind of evoking what has been displaced or lost, or the prehistory of this. You know, the whole modernist aesthetic that these works are based upon. You could maybe, if you were trying to put this in a modern art context, you might relate it to painting by Pete Mondrian, for example, right? Similar kind of sensibility. These were works that were produced when industrialization was just gathering steam. You know, no pun intended. So, like, you know, steel plants, electrification, the whole kind of utopian rhetoric that surrounded this new technological age fed into and inspired works like Mondrian's. And Gillick is kind of asking us to look back at that history and compare what was expected from this new age, from these new technological achievements, civilizational achievements, and what actually we end up with. You know, we end up with abandoned factories, and fancy hotel lobbies, or, you know, high-end, you know, high design seating at your local Starbucks. It, in that sense, is maybe a reflection also on the recent history of art, you know, or the history of 20th century art, inviting us to reflect on how we value this particular and why we value this particular design aesthetic, this modernist aesthetic, and how it's become separated from some of the social or political agendas and programs that it was at one time associated with. All right, another artist, Rikrit Tiravanija. He became famous in the wake of this exhibition or installation. It's not really clear what we should call it. That was that he put together in 1992, called Untitled (parentheses free). And the work basically just invited people to come into this space, this kind of converted gallery space, and hang out. And Tiravanija, the artist, prepared food for people to share. Like, he made these Thai curries. He himself is ethnically Thai, and but the food wasn't especially fancy. It was kind of, you know, sort of, I guess, like Thai comfort food, or the kind of easy to fix curries with you know, easily obtained ingredients that you know, college students might prepare for themselves if they knew how to make curry. This piece was then recreated in 2007 at David Zwirner Gallery. And this whole idea of creating a piece that creating a work of art that is more or less just a space for people to occupy. This is partly what inspired Nicolas Bourriaud to write about a kind of new movement or a new trend that he saw emerging in contemporary art, which he called relational aesthetics, because it's focused more on maybe the relationships that develop, or the relationships among participants, the social aspects of the art experience, or the art situation, as opposed to the objects that are created, or the the aesthetics of those objects in those spaces. And I think this may be an image of the original work as installed at 303 Gallery in New York in 1992. So another thing he didn't mention is that he took everything that had formed part of the back room space of the gallery. Like the gallery had a kitchen, where I guess people working there could reheat their lunch or whatever, a storeroom, an office, a bathroom. But normally all of that, it was out of view, right? You walk into an art gallery and you just see these white-walled spaces, these rooms that are completely empty of anything except works of art. But in fact, behind the scenes, you have all of these other spaces that also form part of the day-to-day operations of the gallery. So Tirvanija took everything from those spaces, from the kitchen, storeroom, the bathroom, and the office, and displayed them in the main gallery space. In addition to putting together this kind of makeshift kitchen in the office space where he cooked and served Thai curry. So have we looked at previous examples of works of art that did similar things, or that we might be able to connect with this one, this kind of intervention in the gallery space, the gallery architecture?
There was that one artist that transformed the gallery space temporarily. So the light from the doorway, I forget his name.
Michael Asher, right? I think you're talking about.
Yeah, it was Michael Asher.
Yeah. So I think you're talking about this work, right?
Mm-hmm.
This is the entrance to Pomona College Art Gallery. If you walk inside, you can see that the space has been kind of cut up or partitioned in such a way that you're funneled into this very narrow passage. It's very short, very tight, kind of cramped passage, and then find yourself in a room on the other side that is completely dark, is illuminated only from the light that enters through that passage from the entryway. Here's another view of the passage between those two spaces. This is the plan. So in what ways would you say these works are similar? In what ways are they different?
Well, they're using the gallery space as part of the work, like the artwork. As the kitchen was like, it was reflecting on the gallery space, kind of taking you to look at where you are.
Mm-hmm.
Same as that is how it transformed.
Yeah. And why would these artists, either or both of them, be interested in calling the viewer's attention or the visitor's attention to the gallery space itself, making that the focus of the piece? What kind of, is it some kind of statement that they're making, or?
Yeah.
Sorry, go ahead, Maya.
Oh, you're good. Go ahead.
I was just going to say to maybe broaden people's idea of art, and what art could be, because I mean, architecture is a very, uh, I mean, I never really considered it art before I came to college, but I
Hmm.
mean, it really is, especially if you take it back to like looking at like all the old cathedrals and stuff, and all the time and effort that went into making these structures.
Okay.
So I guess this could be, talking to that a little bit.
Okay, for sure. Um, any other reasons like uh, the the Thomas Crow essay that described Michael Asher's work on site-specific art suggested that there was maybe some kind of significance in the way Asher's installation here frames a view of the property across the street, which is the, the yard belonging to the president's house, the president of Pomona College. So that view becomes kind of the picture, becomes the object of visual attention in this piece, and it sort of turns the whole relationship inside out between what we normally admire or pay attention to and what we kind of forget about when we enter a gallery. So what other things might, I mean, what is it that we're forgetting when we enter gallery spaces that maybe these artists are trying to highlight as important?
We forget like it's a business.
Yeah,
Like there are people working there. There's an agenda behind it. People that own it and all that.
exactly.
Not
Yeah,
just a business.
yeah, right. And it's a business that aims to make money, right? So it refocuses our attention on the way in which art is bought and sold, which, majority of us who can't afford to collect contemporary art um, uh, aren't really thinking about when we visit a gallery. Maybe we're just thinking, oh, how nice it is that we can look at these things here, depending on whether or not we enjoy the experience, I guess. But we're not thinking about like the big money that's at stake, in the art market, or the kinds of uh, institutional structures and power structures that enable um, the exhibition of art, on a college campus, let's say. So there's a big disparity between, the money that and the resources that are devoted to maintaining the, the president's house, the grounds of that house on a college campus, compared to, let's say, the budget of your typical college art gallery. That's something that, Asher's piece is maybe calling attention to here. Or if we go back to, Tirvanijah's piece, um, the bringing all the stuff from the behind the scenes into onto the center stage here also makes the gallery seem a little less glamorous. And so while, Tirvanijah may also be calling our attention to the gallery the operations of the gallery as a business, maybe he doesn't have the same agenda as Asher. Maybe he's not so much making a point about the money or the power structures that that support um, the the making and the exhibition of works of art, but evoking the idea of a real community of gallery goers and gallerists and gallery workers. Maybe he's trying to break down some of those boundaries, and make the art world or the art market a more democratic space in some sense, while also inviting the wealthier gallery goers or art collectors to empathize with the lives of the people who work there, who maybe are hidden not only from the view of us ordinary people, but also from the view of the wealthy collectors who whose motives for collecting art might have something to do with the fact that it seems completely removed from the arena in which they make their money. So, I mean, institutional critique, which is the term that's applied to these works that Crow describes, these site-specific works by people like Michael Asher or Gordon Matta Clark. This is a trend that's associated with this very kind of activist phase in contemporary art, 1960s, when a lot of artists were kind of questioning the role of money in the museum world and in the gallery world. Tervanija is clearly aware of that history, but I'm not sure if he shares all the same motives in doing the things here that he does. Another piece we might think of is that Richard Serra piece, where Serra cut the space of the gallery in half, or separated it so that it became impossible to see the whole space without actually going outside the building. And here again, we could draw a contrast with Tervanija's work, whereas both Serra and Asher are screening off certain sections of the gallery. Tervanija's opening them all up. So there's that utopian gesture. And there is also the idea, there's the utopianism of this idea of sharing food, right? It sort of evokes like the hippie communes or these collective meals, because he gave away this curry for free. People could hang out in this gallery for free. That's where the title comes from, in part. Another view here. And, you might be wondering, as artists yourselves, like, well, how do you make any money off of a piece like this if it's all free and if it's not producing an object that somebody can buy? He does, in fact, sell things, as a way of, supporting his career as an artist. But they tend to be kind of scraps of these installations, like relics of these installations. So these cans of curry paste that he used to make the curry might be sold as a work. And people buy it, not probably because they view it as a very, as an interesting work on its own terms, as sculpture. Obviously, you could relate it to the example of the Duchamp ready-made, but they buy because, or they find it compelling because it has this history, it has this association with the larger installation piece that had all these other dimensions to it. You can't, you can't freeze in time or preserve a situation, a dinner party, this kind of temporary intervention in a gallery's day-to-day operations, but you can preserve traces of it. All right, so this is another one of these curry dinners Tervanija put together, this time in 2011, with all of these hipster-ish looking people. The title evokes a famous movie by German director. I think it's Fassbinder, called Ali Fear Eats the Soul, about it's about the kind of integration or non-integration of immigrants in German society. So this piece too maybe gestures towards some kind of political or social subtext, but in the event, it just consists of people hanging out, mostly art world people, right? You can tell from the way they're dressed. These people spend a lot of time going to art exhibitions, drinking, cheap beer or whatever, like the Rolling Rock, or it's like the Pabst Blue Ribbon of the gallery world, I think. Another view of this recreation of the early piece, featuring something which I don't think you don't actually, oh yeah, you do have this in the original, this kind of platform created with plywood and 2x4s, which partitions the space and creates a kind of eating area. This piece also, I think, was in part a attempt to recreate a famous Gordon Matta Clark work called Open House. Matta Clark repurposed this this gigantic dumpster or waste container, the kind of thing that they set up at like construction sites, and he filled the interior of it with or in the interior of this waste container, he constructed a kind of maze made out of salvaged door frames and bits and pieces of house construction. And he set this up in Soho, downtown Manhattan, where he lived and where a lot of artists lived. You remember, I think I showed I shared a photograph of that co-op restaurant that he opened with some of his friends called Food in Soho. Matta Clark, who was trained as an architect, was very deeply interested in issues of urbanism, and development, and he was also, product of the 60s, somebody who was concerned with things like gentrification and interested in ways in which people could reclaim urban space or kind of protest against the inequalities that are perpetuated by certain types of policies, and by the way the real estate market functions and so forth. this piece was then incorporated, or reconstructed, of course, decades later, an exhibit in this group show in 2011, which specifically focused on artists who were part of this downtown Soho scene. Not only Matta Clark, but Laurie Anderson, a famous kind of multimedia performance artist. I don't know if anyone is familiar with her work. But we did discuss a piece by her a couple of weeks ago, that piece, Objection, Objectivity, where she photographed various men who catcalled her as she, went about her business, and blacked out their eyes, and included, captions describing what they said to her. And Trisha Brown, who is a very famous, very important choreographer of modern dance, who collaborated with Robert Rauschenberg, among other people, other artists. So part of this this installation that was recreated in 2007, part of it was recreating his 1992 piece, Untitled Free. Parts of it, I think, were recreating Gordon Matta Clark's open house. So on the top right and bottom left in this slide, you see these structures that were built out of plywood, kind of in imitation of that maze in the waste container that Gordon Matta Clark created. Yeah, this is that photograph that we talked about the other week. So a number of the artists associated with relational aesthetics very consciously they acknowledge a connection to this earlier generation of artists of the 60s and 70s, and they're, the utopian or kind of countercultural aspects of those artists' works, the collectivist kind of aspects of Gordon Matta Clark's practice with his restaurant and his interventions in downtown Soho. Another artist who is included in Borio's show is Felix Gonzalez Torres. And his work is participatory in a slightly different sense. So he does create these installations that have a kind of sculptural presence. They consist often of piles of candy or stacks of posters or things like that. But the interactivity comes from the way the audience is invited to engage with them. So, for example, these candy stacks, the visitors are invited to take a piece of candy from the stack. And the stack, or from the pile, I should say. And these piles are replenished over time. So it's not so much, it is a piece that varies over time. It's not maybe so ephemeral as some of the pieces that Thomas Crow is describing that were intended to be temporary. Because as I said, the supply of these individual elements, the candies or the posters, are meant to be replenished. These pieces can always be installed in or reinstalled or exhibited again in different settings, different gallery or museum settings. But what makes it a kind of living piece is the fact that as opposed to being roped off from viewers are actively encouraged to take something here from the piece to participate in the piece in that sort of subtractive or maybe even destructive way, as opposed to the more open-ended kind of participatory or constructive types of engagement that public artworks, participatory artworks sometimes invite. So Borio describes these pieces in terms of the artist's generosity. Right? He's giving away this candy. And so that is an aspect of the work that he obviously, that is obviously shared with Tirvanidja's curry dinners, right? Tirvanidja is also giving away food to his audience. So that's a point of connection. How else could we compare this work with Tirvanidja's? Or what are maybe some differences that we could identify between these two superficially similar forms of participation or audience engagement? What do people think?
They both relate with the gallery, like the form itself. And yeah, it invites a viewer to take part in an action.
Okay. Yeah, and you're right. Gonzalez Torres is also he is bringing our attention to the architectural space of the gallery in the way that these candies are piled here. Like in this case, they're piled up in this corner of the room, kind of calling our attention to an area of the gallery space that we don't ordinarily notice is sort of dead space. And the way these piles are set up, these are not piles that are artistically arranged or composed by the artist, right? It's generally the museum staff or the gallery staff who's in charge of adding more candy or what have you. But it's just kind of deposited there, right? It's not, and so, it has that in common with maybe Smithson's flow pieces or Linda Benglis's poured paintings or her sculptures that were created by pouring lead into a corner of the room, or Richard Serra's casting lead piece for that matter. It has a similar kind of anti-form or post-minimalist aspect to it, where it just takes its shape from the action of gravity on this mass of material. So that's maybe a similarity and a difference. Both artists are engaging with the architecture of the gallery, but in different ways. Gonzalez Torres more as a kind of sculptor in the tradition of post-minimalism. Tirvanidja more in the tradition of institutional critique, works by Michael Asher or Metta Clark. What about the title of the piece? Does that suggest anything about the artist's intentions here?
Maybe like consumerism in America.
Okay. Yeah.
Makes me think of the news.
Right. Yeah, the newspaper, USA Today, which is similarly a kind of disposable, mass-produced object, that is shared or that is shared out, disseminated. the same way that these candies are being given away. Sorry, go ahead.
I guess like kind of pun intended, but like it feeds Americans like information.
Yeah.
Like same as this.
Right. And is it maybe making a statement about the quality of that information?
I would say so.
In what way?
Like how it's people want it because it's like it tastes good, or it's like it's nice to hear or something.
Yeah, it goes down easy. It's easy to digest, right? It's
Mhm.
it's the news in a form that that the masses um, can tolerate, or it's like a quick fix of information. USA Today is famous for those factoids, right? Those little graphic charts that make you feel like you're learning something about what's going on, even when you're not. And they're very colorful. So they kind of, it's kind of like junk food in a way, right? You get your fix of news, but it's not necessarily nutritional. How much are you really learning about the world, and how um, how much do you really understand about what's going on as a result? So that's another thing that I think would just differentiate Felix Gonzalez Torres's work from Chervanidze's. It has a kind of darker, more critical edge. And if we think about what was in the news in 1990, does anyone have any idea? I know that 1990, that was what, 30 years ago? So I don't think any of you were born then. Maybe a tricky question.
Wasn't Bush in office? Like the
Yeah, for part of that time, Bush Senior.
or something. Yeah.
Uh-huh. And anything else that was going on that you might have heard about or read about, maybe resonates with our contemporary situation? Sorry, I can't quite hear what you're saying there.
Wasn't there a trade agreement or something with North American like?
There was that. There was NAFTA. That was sort of in the early days of globalization. I'm not sure I don't know if that was Jackson who was speaking up before or who that was. I couldn't quite make it out. But another, headlining kind of news item of the day was the AIDS crisis. And this was something that touched Gonzalez Torres directly. He was a gay man. His own lover ended up dying of AIDS. HIV, AIDS. He as he did himself. And some of these works are directly kind of commenting on that. Also, he did a number of works that commented on these themes of love and death, mortality. So this piece called Perfect Lovers.
Yeah, I remember this one.
These clocks. Oh, yeah?
It's it symbolizes, him and his, I guess his partner, lovers, and symbolizes like the clocks are kind of, they tick a little bit differently, and like they'll eventually die.
Yeah, they start out in sync, and they just run out. They're just gradually running out of time, and they diverge slightly, but they're both going to end up running out of battery in the end. So kind of allusion to his his confrontation with the death of his partner and of himself. This was a billboard project So he also tried to engage public space in new and different ways. In his case, through these billboards, an evocative image of a bed with two pillows with depressions in them, obviously, a bed for a couple, but empty. And this one, Lover Boys, I think was based on the combined weight of the artist and his partner. I know that there was this piece, Portrait of Ross in LA. Ross was the name of his partner, who at the time was dying. And all of these pieces specify an ideal weight. So that's how they start out. And of course, it fluctuates. It goes down as people take candies and then is restored every night or whenever the gallery staff add more candies. But 175 pounds was Ross's, his partner's healthy body weight. And as he died, it was kind of wasting away from AIDS, from this disease. The artist witnessed him getting thinner and thinner, and so his weight was a direct index to his overall health and to how much time he had left. Looking at these pieces that way as a kind of analog for a stand-in for the human being, they take on a very poignant quality, and that's also something that maybe distinguishes Gonzalez Torres' work from some of these other artists. He's also known for these stacks of posters that are kind of cheaply printed and then just given away. So, potentially infinite number are given away. An individual print, I don't think, has any significant value. So it's not exactly the same as giving away, an artist giving away paintings or something like that, unique works of art or limited editions of photographs. I'm not sure if that's changed more recently since the artist's death, but there is this idea that everybody is participating in the work, that everybody gets to share in the work, but also that they're kind of contributing to its disappearance. And a lot of the imagery evokes a sense of loss or passage or disappearance or emptiness. All right, I think we're going to stop there because I don't want to keep you guys any longer. And this is fine. We've got plenty more to talk about next Tuesday. And as I was saying at the beginning of class, this is our last scheduled reading. So I'm happy to extend the conversation into next week. And then at that point, I think I'm going to assign some extra credit readings, and people will have the option, if they want, of doing those readings and submitting discussion questions. And then we can have conversations about those texts and those artists, the artists discussed in them in our last few class sessions of the semester. Or at least maybe say next Thursday and next Tuesday, and then possibly a review session in preparation for the final exam. Sorry to have to mention that. You guys probably don't want to be thinking about that quite yet, but if you are thinking about it, I can reassure you that I will be sharing more information about what to expect and maybe helping you prepare for that. Excellent. All right. So does anybody have any questions about anything?
I have a question. For American art history, do you still want the presenters to take the quiz or no?
No, that's not a requirement.
Okay. I wasn't sure. I was like, I know the answers, but
Right. Well, sometimes I change those questions actually, so it would be interesting. But no, generally I don't. Since for ordinary presentations, you're not taking your own quiz. I'm just going to stick to that
okay.
that routine here.
Gotcha.
Cool. Any other questions? All right. Well, thanks everybody for joining me again, and enjoy your weekends. Stay safe, and hope everybody's doing well. And I look forward to seeing you next week.
Bye.
Thank you, Seth.
Thank you. All right.
Bye.
Ciao for now.